bad news for U.S. industry, but certainly that's good. If the narrative is we want to stop global warming, then okay, that's what you would need to have happen. Okay, but back to my main story here. Again, the fact that Trump said the U.S. we're pulling out of this thing, we're not doing it, and everyone's saying, uh-oh, there goes the planet. That doesn't make sense when you realize that people who are extreme advocates for strong global warming policies, for example, this guy David Roberts from Vox, he was saying no country on earth is taking the 2-degree climate target seriously. All right, and he wrote that in late April of 2017, so that was before Trump pulled out of Paris. Okay, so going into Trump's decision to tell everyone the U.S. is pulling out, serious people, and again, if you don't know him, but just your background, again, this guy David Roberts is very much in favor of aggressive government action to intervene, and he's telling everybody, the governments of the world by their own announced targets, that's not going to add up to stopping climate change from surpassing the 2-degree target. Give you another example. So there's this website, climateactiontracker.org, you can check out. Again, these are not Republican conservatives by any stretch. These are left-wing progressives who are very much thinking humanity is going to wreck the planet if we don't do something quick. And they have on their website this nice icon, thermometer looking at the Paris Agreement. Okay, so you can see here the goal, so that's 1.5 C. I know it's might be small for some of you in the back there. It says we are here, 1 degree C warming as of 2018. Okay, so as of the year 2018, when we say how much has the Earth warmed, it's about 1 degree Celsius compared to pre-industrial times. And so they're saying, oh, we only got half a degree left of comfort from when scientists are saying we're going to go beyond a tipping point. This is like, what the aggressive UN goal was and what the Paris aggressive goal is. And they're saying right now, the pledges and targets. So if we took all the countries at their word for who are in the Paris Agreement, and let's assume they all did what they said they were going to do, even so, warming could be anywhere from 3.8 C down to 2.4, and best guess of about 3 degrees Celsius. And then if you say the more realistic thing, like, okay, let's not say what the governments promised they would do. What are they actually doing right now? Because again, it's painful. You're one government, you're going to limit your country's emissions. That mostly benefits the rest of the world in terms of lower temperature, whereas it's your economy that's suffering. So that's kind of the deal here, is that each participant is agreeing to slow its own growth, but kind of on the expectation, okay, you guys are all going to reciprocate, right? So we're all going to keep the planet from warming too much, according to these standard models. So you would expect the pledges to be more optimistic or generous than they actually follow through with, especially if some other government gets elected down the road. And so this site, again, that's very concerned about what they think is the obvious reality, the existential threat of climate change. They're saying right now, the current policies of all the governments who are still in the Paris Agreement will lead to global warming of about 3.3 C. Okay, so to me, the story here is not, oh my gosh, Donald Trump pulled out. The story is clear that this was not working. It is not working, and you're distracting people by focusing on Trump having pulled out. So it's true, all the things, no one's going to stick in it if the U.S. isn't in it. I mean, I get that claim about leadership, but wouldn't it also be a leader to pull out of something that clearly isn't going to solve the problem even on its own terms? Okay, so whatever you think about Trump's decision, I'm trying to get you to see here, the only way that normal reaction makes sense is if this Paris Agreement were going to work, and then Trump ruined everything. Whereas you can see, no, this wasn't anywhere close to being on track to working, even according to their own models. Okay, real quickly, let me mention something, because I know some of you might be more policy wonkish, and especially with being conservative Republicans, this is something that's been floated around certain like DC think tanks to conservatives and libertarians, and it goes something like this. So like Arthur Laffer took this approach of Laffer curve fame. There's the Niskanen Center in DC. R Street was an organization out of Texas. So what they're doing is they're going around to, and they have a few like Curbelo and a few other, they had some people up, Republican legislators, and what they were doing is saying to the Republican base, or conservatives generally, let's say, look, we understand you don't trust Al Gore. okay? We don't trust him either, we don't like the guy. But this is a real thing, and they say, but you know what, it doesn't matter. Whether or not this climate change stuff is the threat that the people on the left, the Democrats, that Hillary, or whoever the latest person is that they're worried about, is saying, cut a deal with it, call their bluff. Say to them, okay, if this isn't about big government, if you really are just concerned about saving the planet, go ahead and put in place a carbon tax, but then agree that you won't use it to spend more money. You're not going to spend it on green projects. You're not going to give it as block grant assistance to other groups, or you're not going to use it to fund new battery programs. What you're going to do is give tax cuts to Americans, right? Lower payroll tax, lower the income tax rate, and have it be revenue neutral. So the government's not keeping more money. They're just putting in place a carbon tax to disincentivize people from emissions, and then they use that money to reduce taxes on labor and capital formation, right? So if like Arthur Laffer, how he's real big on trying to cut taxes and the stimulative supply side effects of that. That's what he was saying, that if it's bad to emit stuff, and their slogan is tax bads, not goods, right? Which is kind of a catchy thing. They say, look, we all agree carbon emissions probably aren't great. Maybe that's not as bad as some people are warning, but probably not a good thing. Whereas working and saving, that everyone agrees that's good stuff. So if the government's got to tax something, let's tax emissions. And again, we can call the left's bluff and tell them, you want a carbon tax? Okay, fine, but you don't get to spend that money. You got to use it to get tax cuts. And if you don't want to do that, then that kind of reveals this isn't about the climate, is it? It's just you want more money, right? So that was the rhetorical strategy. So I understand where they're coming from, but I just want to point out that doesn't work on its own terms, right? That the literature does not support that. If they go so far as to say, which plenty of them do say, that whether or not climate change is a big deal, if we put in place a carbon tax and use the money to cut these other taxes in a revenue neutral scheme, the economy would grow faster, we'd have more employment, and if climate change is a thing, well, then it helps there too, right? That's the way they were selling it, and I want to say that it's actually, the literature doesn't support that. So this is the one slide I'll just show you on that, and then I'll move on to a separate topic here. This is just showing what happens to the economy from implementing a carbon dioxide tax at $30 a ton and then using the revenue to refund different things. Okay, so if you just give the money back to Americans in a dividend payment, which some groups are wanting to do, it hurts the economy the most. You can see it gets down to like about negative 3.5% of GDP. So that the economy is about 3.5% smaller with that approach than if they didn't do anything. The only way to get a positive amount, that green line, is if they use the money from the carbon tax to cut capital taxes, like the corporate income tax. Okay, so again, just what this is showing, and this chart was from a pro-carbon tax group. So again, with all this stuff, I'm going to people who are sympathetic to it, and I'm using their own numbers just to show you some of the stronger claims for aggressive action don't hold up. That if you were to put in place a tax on carbon and use the money dollar for dollar to cut other taxes, unless you just did it for the corporate income tax, the economy would hurt. Okay, so the last thing here I'll mention, so I've gone through and shown you, it's true, I don't think that the impacts of climate change are as severe as some of the more apocalyptic measures or warnings, and I think I've shown you the approach of the governments of the world to try to solve this so far isn't working, even according to their own warnings. So you say, okay, so what do we do? So let me just mention, if this is an issue, humans are working on other possible solutions that don't involve government funding or a specific government program. So here, let's only give you 4 different types of options. So one thing is, and I know some of these are fanciful, but again, you want people thinking outside the box because the stuff they're doing right now is not going to work according to their own models. So when Mount Pinatubo erupted, put up a lot of ash in the air, and then global temperatures were measurably lower for several months afterward, right, until the ash fell out of the air. And so using that idea, scientists are working on ways of pumping up sulfur dioxide into an appropriate elevation, and the number keeps coming down for the cost, but they're saying right now to minimize the impact of global warming. So again, the physics of it is you've got sulfur dioxide now that you're pumping up in the air, that reflects some of the incoming sunlight. So that counteracts the fact that higher CO2 traps more, heat in because of the greenhouse effect. So by doing that, that would cost about $250 million. And that's how much Al Gore wanted to raise to spend money on just raising awareness, right? In terms of we need to do something about climate change. Again, just showing you, I didn't show you the numbers before, but the cost in terms of just limiting emissions to try to arrest climate change is in the several trillions of dollars in terms of the present value of that future flow. So if we were going to just limit emissions as a way to try to directly stop it, you can see how expensive that would be. Another idea is to fertilize the oceans with iron. Okay, and so you drop iron, that makes various things bloom. So there's more plant growth in the oceans, and that absorbs more CO2. Right? So again, the issue is there's too much CO2 in the air. How do we suck some of that out? This is one proposal. And again, scientists are looking at that to figure out how could we actually do this on a massive scale. You may have heard, some of you, this physicist Freeman Dyson. He had an idea to genetically modify trees to absorb more CO2. All right, so he was saying, okay, it would take a while to get to a certain point, but certainly by the year 2030, 2040, he thinks it would be easy for agronomists who have engineered trees, normal trees, except they have the property of they're very absorbent of CO2. So that's, think about what a tree does. It takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, sucks it into itself. So he's saying that's one way of implementing this. And then beyond that, there's literally a direct air capture technology they're working on. You can go look at YouTube videos of this. So it's just, giant turbines that spin, they suck air through them. Just like if you have like a dehumidifier in your basement or something and it sucks moisture out, well, they can literally extract carbon directly from the air. So technologically that's possible. They wouldn't do this right now because it's too expensive. It would be cheaper to just not put CO2 in the atmosphere in the first place rather than sucking it out. But this is one thing that they are working on. Okay, so in summary here for these prepared remarks, yes, there is an issue with climate change. I think a lot of the warnings have been exaggerated. So if you go and read the fine print on some of this, a lot of this stuff, it will say these things could happen or may happen. And yeah, it might. And there could be an asteroid that comes. There's all sorts of things that could threaten and cause huge damages, even though they might be low probability. And the question is, what do people do in terms of getting ready for it? And I would say the particular measures that the governments of the world have proposed, if you actually look at it and say, okay, doing that thing versus not doing that thing, is that going to solve the problem? And the answer is no, it wouldn't. And even something like the Paris Climate Agreement, which clearly is the best example of a global coordinated effort of the governments of the world to solve something like this, you see the problem that what they've agreed to wouldn't come anywhere close to solving the problem according to the way that they've set it up. And then again, the last thing is the rhetoric here does not match the underlying economics of it. So yes, physicists and chemists and biologists, they can certainly talk about different scenarios and look at the natural science and say, if this happens, if this much emissions occur, these might be some of the impacts. But that by itself doesn't prove, therefore, we should stop doing that. So to give you an analogy, an engineer could look at a plane and tell you, well, here's the chance that this plane's going to crash. Given the way it is, given the maintenance you're doing, every such and such million passenger miles, you would expect one plane crash. Is that enough information to know whether this plane should fly or not? It's not, right? I mean, the only way to truly guarantee no plane crashes is if you don't fly. And that's clearly, we don't think that's the right thing to do. We still choose to fly even though, now if there was a 50-50 chance the plane's going to crash, no one wants to get on that plane, right? So the numbers matter. And what I'm saying here too is, yes, there are certain risks in this literature, but when you go and analyze the numbers to see, do they support the conclusions that are then trumpeted as just being matter of fact and obvious, it actually isn't. I don't have it here too because I didn't want to overwhelm you guys with charts, but a more recent example I worked on where somebody was pointing out, oh, well, here's what the UN says will happen and such, or there could be warming of up to this amount, there could be damage up to 25% of global GDP could be wiped out by climate change if we do nothing. And if you go and look and figure out how did they get that number, it was something that was, they had like a probability distribution of what could happen, and it was like, you know, here was the middle of the bell curve, and it went way out to this tail end that you couldn't even see the graphic anymore. Like that's how little it was in terms of the event that would have to happen in order to justify the newspaper headline saying, new report says, you know, this much, the 25% of the global economy could be at stake. So that's not a false statement. Yeah, it could be, but when you look at the report, you see that's a vanishingly small possible outcome. That's probably not what that study said was going to happen. So with all this stuff, humans are going to adapt. They're going to come up with ways to solve it. In general, even if something is a legitimate problem, I don't trust the governments of the world to solve it. And so I would say those of you who are concerned about this, that come up with other types of solutions, things besides just saying, oh, let's have the government do X, Y, and Z to take care of it. Because in general, that usually doesn't work. And on the specific issue of climate change also, the policies that are proposed don't solve the problem, again, even on its own terms. Okay, so thanks for your attention. I'll stop there, and I'll leave the rest of the time for your questions. Yeah?
Would you say for like, to the argument that people will say like you shouldn't do cost benefit, or you shouldn't do like a discount, or you should be on the side of caution, kind of the tail end that you're talking about?
Okay, yeah, so just to repeat that, the question was, what about, there are some who challenge the whole idea of using cost-benefit analysis on this, and also related to say, wait, when you're discounting the future, are you saying like we're more important than future generations? So, again, let me be clear, I was not holding up Nordhaus's model and saying this is the best approximation of human knowledge in this. I was just pointing that out to say, look, he just won the Nobel Prize, everyone was lauding him and saying, thank goodness he's raising awareness on this issue, and the mainstream media was not pointing out how his work didn't support what the UN was saying should be done. Certainly, so the way economists do cost benefit, I don't necessarily endorse that. With these models, you can, within reason, you can produce just about any result you want. And that's what I was saying, like with the discount rate, I can just change that dial. You can make the social cost of carbon look like it's a really big issue, or it's not that big of an issue. So I showed you that little element of it just so you can see how malleable this stuff is, and nobody needs to lie. Right? It's the same thing like if you follow the minimum wage debate, two different teams, in Seattle raised their minimum wage. One team that was generally free market looked at what happened and they said it was a bad idea. Another team, the city didn't like that, Seattle didn't like that result, so they went to the UC Berkeley and hired a team of economists who were very pro minimum wage. They looked at the same episode and said, yep, it was a good idea. And neither team lied. So in economics, it's true, you can kind of pick and choose what you're going to model, what you're going to study, because there's so much going on. So yes, a given study, if you wanted to make it look like climate change isn't a big deal, you can focus on things that like fewer elderly people will die in the winter if temperatures rise. Okay, so there's plenty of benefits from climate change. There's certain regions in Russia where the crop yields will be better if global temperatures go up another ½ degree Celsius. Okay, there's other places in the world where they'll be devastated. So there's a lot of leeway in what you include and how you focus on it. But I don't think it's true to say that, oh, we just don't ignore, or sorry, we don't consider the cost of this stuff. Okay, so in general, if you're going to do something, you do need to know, well, what's the downside? Okay, so again, the particular way you quantify it, I agree, anybody could look at any particular attempt and say, well, that's leaving out a lot of stuff, and of course it will, because it's not as complicated as the world, but it is interesting that, again, I'm not cherry picking models. I'm not going to Cato or Heritage to get this stuff. These are the models that the Obama administration picked. These are the leading things, and they're showing that these aggressive targets don't add up. Again, I would just say with any kind of social policy, like the optimal amount of pollution is not zero. If it were, then we wouldn't have any products. Okay, things like that. The optimal amount of fatalities on the interstate highways is not zero. Even though that sounds like a funny thing, like, don't we want there to be 0 people to die? Well, yeah, but we also want to get places and not be driving in tanks. Okay, so there's trade-offs involved, and so yes, even though oh wow it sounds harsh, it's still true. You wouldn't want to do something that causes more damage than it spares. So that's the way. As far as the issue of the generations, So yes, that thing with the discount rate I showed, what I was doing was saying that the higher you make that number, the bigger the discount rate, then the less of a emergency climate change seems to be, right? Because what's happening is, so you just understand it conceptually, that $500 billion damage we're going to cause in the year 2200, in a 1% discount rate, that might right now still be pretty important. But at a 5% discount rate, it shrinks in importance just because that's been, rolling over at interest for 200 years, if you think of it that way, at 5%. So people who want to have the urgency of climate change still be front and center will say, you can't dismiss the welfare of future generations, you shouldn't discount it. So that gets kind of philosophical. All I'll say is, to the extent that the people in the year 2200 are going to be a lot richer, certainly that needs to come into play. So in general, people in the future are going to have more wealth, have a higher standard of living than we will, and so just on normal ethical grounds, just like you wouldn't want to tax $1,000 from a homeless guy and give it to a rich guy, or from a working class person and give it to a multimillionaire. That would be goofy. In the same way, the fact that people near 2200, generally speaking, are going to be far richer than we are, that surely is something to consider. Other questions? Yep.
Given the proposals you have on the board and on the photo, how realistic do you think those are?
Okay, so she was asking, how realistic are these? So I don't, I'm not a scientist with credentials to evaluate the efficacy of these particular things. They were outlined, if you want to read more in the book, Super Freakonomics. And like I said, this direct air capture, you can go and look at the YouTube. So for the direct air capture, I mean, it works. It's not just something on the drawing board. Like they're doing it, but it's just like I say, the amount they have to spend per ton of carbon that they suck out is not worth. Like it would just be cheaper to pay people to drive electric vehicles. But it's coming down. So at some point that will be low enough. So this might answer your question better. Eventually, presumably humanity's not going to rely so much on carbon-intensive fuels, right? Like people stopped using a horse and buggy and switched to a car, not because the government put in place a manure tax, but just because technologically speaking, cars made more sense. And so I think at some point, as battery power improves, as they just get better at making solar panels and things, it may very well be that wind and solar are the dominant forms of newly installed capacity going forward. There's projections about that. That may very well be true. So it's not that I'm for or against wind or solar or coal or natural gas. So that very well may be true. So the issue is just, to me, what if there isn't a problem and it is the case that, by the time just natural market forces would have made us all move over to, real quiet electric vehicles and that, they don't smell or anything, maybe that would cause unacceptably high warming. Well, then you could do some of these, so this, it works. The issue is just, is that going to cause some other unintended consequences? So they know they can do this, and it's just a matter of, maybe that would cause other problems. It's the same thing with this. They know they can do it. It's just a matter of, that might screw up the ecosystem, and maybe we don't want to do that. So with all these things, it's an issue of what the possible consequences would be. So I think at the very least, it's okay to wait longer to get more information because you have these